In 18 minutes, 1,198 died off Ireland. Aboard a ship its captain swore no submarine could catch. That morning, a German warning ran beside her sailing ad. Captain William Turner sailed anyway. One boiler room cold, no zigzag, no escort. Somebody had decided the Lusitania didn't need protecting. By the end, you'll know exactly which decisions, and whose, put 1,900 people in a torpedo's path and why America still waited. In July 2025, Houthi missiles sank 2 civilian cargo ships in the Red Sea. The tactic never died. Off Kinsale, Walter Schwieger pressed his eye to the U-20's periscope and read the ship's name in gold letters. The easy version of this story says Germany was a rogue aggressor, that a submarine commander torpedoed a defenseless liner, and that single act of savagery dragged America into the First World War. That version isn't false. It's just too small. It leaves out a notice printed in the newspapers the morning the ship sailed, warning passengers exactly what might happen. It leaves out a boiler room shut down weeks earlier to save coal, quietly cutting the fastest liner afloat down to a speed a submarine could actually catch. It leaves out the straight, predictable course her captain held instead of zigzagging, and a naval escort that had been expected and never arrived. And it leaves out something almost nobody wants to say out loud. The ship really was carrying munitions. Not the secret arsenal German propaganda claimed, but real cartridges and real shell fuses sitting in the hold of a liner sold to the public as pure luxury. None of that erases who fired the torpedo, but it explains why the blame became a battlefield of its own, fought in courtrooms and newspapers for years, and why the sinking didn't send America to war the next morning. It took nearly 2 more years. To understand why, go back further than the torpedo, to a deal the Lusitania was built to honor before she ever carried a single passenger. By the turn of the century, Germany's shipping lines were beating Britain at its own game, building bigger, faster liners and taking the blue riband, the trophy for the fastest Atlantic crossing, away from British owners. American financiers were buying up shipping companies on both sides of the ocean, and the British government looked at that and saw a real risk. American money quietly controlling the ships Britain would need if war ever came. So in 1903, the government made Cunard an offer that looked generous and was actually a contract with teeth. A loan of £2.6 million, repayable over 20 years at 2.75% interest, plus an operating subsidy of roughly £75,000 a year and a mail contract on top. In exchange, Cunard had to build its new ships in British yards, keep them capable of top speed at all times, and hand them over to the Royal Navy as armed cruisers the moment the government asked. The Lusitania wasn't just a passenger ship. She was a strategic asset with a first-class dining room. Built at John Brown and Company's yard on the Clyde, launched on June 7, 1906, she took the blue ribbon back from Germany within weeks of her maiden voyage in September of 1907. 31,550 tons, 787 feet long, longer than 2.5 football fields laid end to end. A service speed of 25 knots, faster than any submarine on Earth could manage, even on the surface. That speed was the entire point of the government's investment. 8 years later, it would also be the reason her captain believed nothing could touch her. Picture what crossing the Atlantic actually meant in 1907. It wasn't a quick flight. It was the better part of a week at sea. And for most travelers, that meant cramped steerage decks packed with immigrants chasing a new life in America, forgettable food, and little privacy, while a smaller number of passengers upstairs lived in something closer to a floating hotel. Cunard and its German rivals had turned that top tier into chandeliers, orchestras, private suites, and mahogany paneling because national pride and ticket revenue both rode on the same ship. Whichever line owned the fastest, grandest liner owned the bragging rights of the whole North Atlantic, and newspapers on both sides of the ocean covered new launches the way they'd cover a heavyweight title fight, tallying knots and tonnage like a scoreboard between empires. Losing the blue riband to Germany hadn't just stung Cunard's shareholders. It had embarrassed a government that treated its merchant fleet as an extension of its navy. That rivalry is exactly why this isn't really a story about one ship's bad luck. So everyone assumes this is a shipwreck story. It isn't, not really. It's a story about a warning nobody wanted to believe, one that would eventually run in print beside an advertisement for the very voyage it was warning against, and about a government-built asset that turned out to have a wartime weakness nobody had priced into the contract back in 1903. For most of her career, that confidence wasn't misplaced. It was earned. Between 1907 and 1915, the Lusitania completed 202 Atlantic crossings without serious incident, building a reputation as one of the fastest, safest, most modern ships afloat, exactly what the Cunard government deal had promised to deliver. When war broke out in 1914, that confidence didn't fade, it hardened. German submarines could barely manage 13 or 14 knots even on the surface, nowhere near the Lusitania's 25. On paper, outrunning a submarine wasn't a gamble, it was arithmetic. It also gave the Admiralty a built-in excuse not to spend a destroyer on escort duty. Why tie up a warship babysitting a liner that could supposedly outrun anything hunting her? That single number, top speed, had sold Cunard's whole pitch to the British government back in 1903, and now it was doing double duty as an informal wartime survival plan, one nobody in government had ever actually tested against a real attack. Passengers believed it. Newspapers repeated it. Cunard's own board leaned on it too, because a ship that didn't need protecting was a ship nobody had to pay twice for. Even after Germany declared the waters around Britain a war zone in February of 1915, ticket sales for the Lusitania barely moved, and crossings kept selling out. People trusted the ship more than they feared the war, which sounds like confidence. It was actually a gap between what the ship was supposed to be able to do and what she was actually going to do on this one specific crossing. The Lusitania genuinely could outrun almost anything Germany had on the water. What almost nobody outside a Cunard boiler room knew was that for this voyage, she wasn't going to be running anywhere near full speed at all. While Cunard leaned on speed and reputation, Germany was rewriting the rules of the war at sea. Traditional naval warfare required a warship to stop a merchant vessel, search it, and give crew and passengers time into lifeboats before sinking it, customs built for an age before submarines existed. Germany couldn't match Britain's surface fleet ship for ship, so in February 1915 it declared unrestricted submarine warfare around the British Isles. Any Allied flagged ship could be sunk without warning. No searches, no guaranteed lifeboats. It was an underdog throwing out the old rulebook because it couldn't win by playing under it. Kapitän Lieutenant Walter Schwieger commanded U-20, commissioned in August of 1913, and by the spring of 1915 he was patrolling the waters off the southern Irish coast, hunting exactly the kind of large, valuable British-flagged target that regularly passed through it. British Naval Intelligence, the code-breaking unit known as Room 40, had already picked up signs of U-20's activity in that stretch of sea and passed the warnings up the chain. Room 40's intercepts pointed to roughly which patch of coastline the submarine was working. Those warnings reached the Admiralty. They reached shore stations along the Irish coast. What they did not produce was a destroyer escort for the Lusitania. The Navy knew, in general terms, roughly where the danger was sitting. It sent messages. It didn't send warships. That's not a footnote in this story. That's a second wall closing in, a warning system that worked exactly as designed, attached to a response that simply never arrived. This is where people get the timeline wrong. They picture the danger starting the moment the torpedo left its tube. It started weeks earlier, quietly, inside the ship itself. On April 22, 1915, the German embassy in Washington placed a notice in American newspapers, reminding travelers that Britain and Germany were at war, that the waters around the British Isles were a declared war zone, and that any ship flying the British flag entered those waters at its own risk. That notice ran on May 1st, 1915, the morning the Lusitania sailed from New York, printed in the same column as Cunard's own advertisement for that day's crossing. Reporters asked passengers if they were nervous. Most laughed it off. Captain William Turner, a career Cunard officer who had crossed the Atlantic longer than almost anyone alive, reportedly waved the whole warning away as, in his own words, the greatest joke he'd ever heard. That's the part that still bothers me. The warning wasn't buried. It was set in the same type, on the same page, as the ticket sale, and everyone chose to read it as marketing noise instead of a threat. Underneath that public confidence sat a second, quieter decision nobody announced at all. To save coal, one of the Lusitania's 4 boiler rooms had been shut down for this crossing. Part of a cost-cutting pattern that had quietly become routine that spring, which is exactly why nobody treated it as a red flag. It shaved several knots off her top speed without costing Turner a single word of his public certainty. This wasn't just frugality. It was the exact advantage the ship had been built around, quietly given away, on the one crossing where it would have mattered most. The ship built to outrun anything on the water was, on this specific voyage, no longer that ship, and almost nobody outside her engine room knew it. Stack these pieces up and watch the walls close in one at a time. A printed warning ignored is survivable on its own. Ships had crossed under worse warnings before without incident. Reduced speed alone is survivable too, if the course compensates for it, weaving unpredictably so a submarine's slow, awkward firing calculations never quite line up. Zigzagging was already a known countermeasure that year, meant to keep a torpedo run from ever lining up. But Turner held a straight, steady line instead, which meant a slower ship was also an easier one to track and predict, turning one problem into 2 that reinforced each other. Add the missing destroyer escort the Admiralty had the intelligence to justify and never provided, and there's no second layer of protection left to catch what the ship's own choices had already exposed. Add Schwieger, a trained commander already stalking that exact stretch of water off the old head of Kinsale, looking for precisely this kind of target, and the corridor the Lusitania was sailing through stopped being theoretical. And add one more piece the public didn't fully reckon with at the time. The Lusitania's manifest genuinely listed around 4,200 cases of Remington rifle cartridges and roughly 1,250 cases of shrapnel, shell fuses, close to 173 tons of material, live rounds, divers would later recover intact from the wreck. Physical proof the cargo had been real all along. This was not the secret cache of high explosives German propaganda insisted on. It was real munitions, just far smaller in scale than either side wanted the public to believe, and both governments needed their own version of that cargo to be true. Germany to justify the attack after the fact, Britain to insist the ship carried nothing that mattered. Each of these 5 pressures on its own is the kind of thing an ocean liner survives every week of a war. A warning gets ignored and nothing happens. A boiler gets shut down and the crossing still finishes on time. A course holds steady, and 99 times out of 100, no submarine is close enough to care. Redundancy protects you from one mistake at a time. It was never built to survive 5 of them landing in the same afternoon. None of these pressures alone sinks a ship this size this fast. Together, on one specific afternoon, in one specific patch of water, they built a corridor with almost no margin left for error. And on the afternoon of May 7, 1915, the Lusitania sailed straight down the middle of it. If you want the real story behind the headline, and not the myth, that's a decent reason to subscribe before the next one drops. At 2:10 in the afternoon, lookouts on deck spotted a white wake cutting across the calm, sunlit water, closing fast. Schwieger fired a single torpedo from roughly 700 meters. It struck the starboard side below the bridge. The ship's own distress call went out a minute later. Within seconds, witnesses and Schwieger's own war diary describe a second explosion, violent and far larger than one torpedo should have produced. Researchers still debate the cause. Some point to the genuine munitions sitting in the hold. Many modern experts lean toward a boiler room or coal dust explosion instead. What isn't in dispute is what that second blast did to the ship's chances. The Lusitania rolled hard and immediately to starboard, a list so severe it jammed lifeboats against their own davits before crews could swing them clear. Some boats spilled passengers into the sea as they were lowered unevenly. Others crushed against the hull on the way down. On the tilting deck, empty wooden chairs slid downhill in rows, chasing people toward the rail as the whole ship canted further with every passing minute. Of 48 lifeboats on board, only 6 ever made it into the water in any usable shape. Enough lifeboats existed on paper for everyone aboard. The list made half of them impossible to launch in practice. Nearby boats turned toward the smoke almost immediately, but 18 minutes left no time to close the distance. The ship that had crossed the Atlantic 202 times without a scratch went under, bow first, off the Irish coast in 18 minutes flat. The same golden letters Schwieger had read through his periscope were now the last thing many survivors saw of her, tilting under the surface. Schwieger's own diary describes watching what translators have rendered as a swarm of people spilling across her tilting decks as she disappeared beneath the water. 1,198 people died that afternoon, out of roughly 1,959 aboard, more than 6 in 10 souls on the ship. 128 of them were Americans, a small fraction of the total dead, but the number that would echo loudest in Washington. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, the railroad heir who couldn't swim and had famously canceled a booking on the Titanic 3 years earlier, was last seen handing his own lifebelt to a young nurse before the water took him. His body was never recovered. A well-known American writer and his wife, traveling together, went down together too. Sources disagree on the exact number of children lost, but every count agrees on the shape of it. The overwhelming majority of the youngest passengers aboard did not survive. Fishing boats out of Kinsale, including the Wanderer, were among the first vessels to reach the wreckage and pull survivors from the water. Bodies were landed at Queenstown for burial in mass graves. Weeks later, a coroner's inquest in Kinsale returned a verdict accusing the Kaiser and the German government of what it called willful and wholesale murder, the earliest legal judgment on record anywhere on the sinking. Captain Turner survived. In the weeks that followed, parts of the British establishment moved fast to make him the story's villain instead of the Navy's own choices. Senior figures within the Admiralty privately dismissed him as little better than a knave and pushed for the case against him to be pursued without check. A formal inquiry heard the evidence that Summer and exonerated him outright, ruling that he had exercised his judgment for the best in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. This was not a case of the truth simply winning out. It was a captain absorbing blame that belonged in large part to the warnings the Navy chose not to escort, and the boiler decision Cunard chose not to publicize. The brand of blame survived. The real chain of decisions behind it mostly didn't get punished at all. None of this on its own put the United States into the First World War. That's the part people get wrong most often, and it's the answer this whole story has been building toward. American outrage over the Lusitania was real and immediate, but President Woodrow Wilson held the country to neutrality for nearly 2 more years. In 1916, Germany agreed to the Sussex Pledge, promising to stop unrestricted attacks on passenger ships, and for a while the diplomatic pressure eased. It was Germany's own decision to resume unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1, 1917, followed weeks later by the exposure of the Zimmermann telegram, a proposal for Germany to help Mexico reclaim territory from the United States that finally pushed Congress to declare war on April 6, 1917. Roughly 700 days separate the sinking from the declaration. The Lusitania didn't start America's war. It planted the idea in the public imagination, and then 2 later German decisions, made almost 2 years apart, finished what the sinking had only begun. Today the wreck rests about 11 miles off the old head of Kinsale, 93 meters down, close enough to shore that her position still shows up on any chart of those waters. On shore, a memorial garden holds a 20-meter wave sculpture with the name of every person who was aboard that day carved into its curve, pointing out toward the water where she still lies. The ship built to be too fast for any submarine to catch was undone. Not by a design flaw, but by a season's worth of quiet decisions stacked on top of each other. A warning nobody acted on, a boiler room shut down to save coal, a course that never changed direction, and an escort that was promised on paper and never sent to sea. The same mechanism is still running. In July of 2025, the cargo ships Magic Seas and Eternity Sea went down under Houthi missile fire in the Red Sea, civilian vessels sunk in waters where crews and insurers had assumed the old rules of warning and restraint still applied. They didn't. The Lusitania didn't pull America into war overnight. It taught the world how an attack on civilians becomes a weapon of persuasion, a lesson that wave sculpture at Kinsale still points toward, curling out to the 11 miles of water where she waits. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the real story instead of the myth, subscribing helps me keep making it. Did an ancestor of yours cross the Atlantic in those years? Or have you ever stood at the old head of Kinsale and read the names carved into that memorial?